Eli Carter woke up early, just as he had for the past 60 years. The sun had not yet risen, but the air was already thick with the scent of damp soil and morning dew. He stretched his stiff joints and reached for the old hat that had been with him through countless seasons of hard work. Outside, his land stretched wide, rolling fields of crops, sturdy wooden fences, and a small red barn standing tall against the endless sky. This land was more than just a farm to Eli. It was his family's legacy. His great-grandfather had bought it after the Civil War, using the little money he had saved. Back then, times were even harder for black farmers, but his ancestors had refused to give up. Through sweat and determination, they had turned the barren earth into something that could feed families, pay bills, and provide a future. Eli's father had worked this land. His grandfather had worked it. And now, even at 72, Eli was still here, hands deep in the dirt, making sure the crops grew strong. He could have sold the farm long ago, moved to a city, and lived an easier life. But he had never been interested in easy things. He believed in hard work, in earning his way, in standing firm when others tried to push him down. He walked toward the chicken coop, scattering feed for the birds. They clucked and flapped their wings, eager for their breakfast. He smiled as he watched them peck at the ground. It was the simple things that gave him joy. The rhythm of farm life was predictable, steady. It kept him grounded. After feeding the chickens, he made his way to the barn. His old tractor stood in the corner, covered in dust, but still reliable. He ran his hand over the metal, remembering the day he had bought it. It had been expensive, but worth every penny. Machines like these made farming a little easier, though nothing could ever replace good old-fashioned labor. The morning passed quickly. By the time the sun was high in the sky, Eli had already checked on the cows, repaired a loose fence, and started plowing a section of land for new crops. He wiped sweat from his forehead and took a sip from his canteen. The water was warm, but it was refreshing after hours under the sun. He leaned against a wooden post, taking a moment to rest. As he looked around, pride swelled in his chest. This land had been fought for, protected through generations. It had seen storms, droughts, and tough times, but it had survived, just like him. But not everyone in town saw the farm the way he did. Over the years, there had been plenty of people who wanted Eli to sell this land. Some made offers, thinking they could pressure him into leaving. Others weren't as polite. They said things like, "Maybe it's time to move on," or "You should let someone else take care of it." Eli knew what they really meant. They didn't want him here. They didn't like that a black farmer still owned some of the best land in the county. He had faced trouble before, strange inspections, surprise tax evaluations, even vandalism. But he never backed down. This farm wasn't just dirt and crops. It was history. It was proof that his family had worked just as hard, if not harder, than anyone else, and he wasn't about to let anyone take that away. Just as he was about to head inside for lunch, a cloud of dust appeared down the dirt road leading to his property. A car was coming fast, kicking up gravel as it approached. Eli squinted, watching as the vehicle slowed near his fence. Two men stepped out, both wearing sheriff's deputy uniforms. Eli sighed and shook his head. He had a feeling this wasn't a friendly visit. He straightened his back and walked toward them, his boots crunching against the dry ground. He had dealt with men like this before. He wasn't scared. But he was tired. Tired of proving himself. Tired of being treated like a stranger on land that had belonged to his family for generations. The deputies adjusted their belts and looked around, as if inspecting the place. One of them took off his sunglasses and stepped forward. "Afternoon," the man said. His tone was friendly, but his eyes were sharp, searching. "We got a report of some suspicious activity out here." Eli crossed his arms and raised an eyebrow. "Suspicious? Ain't nothing suspicious about a man working his own land." The second deputy smirked. "Mind if we take a look around?" Eli's jaw tightened. Here we go again, he thought. But instead of arguing, he took a slow breath and nodded toward his farmhouse. "Before we do this," he said, pulling out his old flip phone, "I think I need to make a quick call." Eli Carter held his old flip phone tightly in his hand, but he didn't dial just yet. Instead, he looked straight into the deputy's eyes, reading their expressions. He had lived long enough to know when a man was here to do his job and when he was here to make trouble. These two, they had come looking for trouble. The first deputy, the one who had taken off his sunglasses, shifted his weight from one foot to the other. He was young, maybe in his early 30s, with sharp features and a badge that still looked new. The second one, slightly older with a rough face, had a smirk that Eli didn't like. Eli took a slow breath and tucked his phone back into his pocket for now. He wasn't going to make that call just yet. First, he wanted to see how far these men were planning to take things. "This land belongs to me," Eli said calmly. "Has been in my family for over 100 years. So I'd like to know exactly what kind of suspicious activity you think is happening here." The younger deputy glanced at his partner, as if expecting him to take the lead. The older one chuckled and adjusted his belt. "We got a report," he said, keeping his voice slow and casual. "Someone said they saw unfamiliar folks moving around this property. Thought maybe something illegal was going on." Eli let out a short laugh, shaking his head. "Unfamiliar folks. Only person moving around this land is me." He gestured to the farm. "Unless you're talking about my chickens, and last I checked, they don't break the law." The younger deputy's lips twitched, like he was holding back a smile, but the older one wasn't amused. He stepped forward, squaring his shoulders. "You mind if we look around?" he asked, but there was no politeness in his voice. It wasn't a request. Eli didn't move. He had been through this before, too many times. He had seen the way men like these tried to act, like they had all the power. But Eli knew his rights. This was his land, and unless they had a warrant or a real reason to be here, they had no business walking around his property like they owned it. "I do mind," Eli said firmly. "You got a warrant." The older deputy's smirk faded. He didn't like being questioned. "Now, Mr. Carter, we're just doing our job. If you've got nothing to hide, why not let us take a quick look?" Eli held his ground. "That's not how it works," he said. "If I let you walk around my land without cause today, then tomorrow you'll be back for something else, and the day after that too. So, unless you got a real reason to be here, I suggest you turn around and head on back to town." The tension in the air thickened. The younger deputy shifted again, looking more unsure now, but the older one wasn't backing down. He took another step forward, now standing only a few feet from Eli. His hand hovered near his holster, not grabbing his gun, but close enough to send a message. Eli saw the move and felt anger rise in his chest, but he kept his face calm. This wasn't the first time someone had tried to scare him, and it wouldn't be the last. But fear wasn't something he carried with him anymore. He had seen too much in his lifetime to let two deputies shake him. "You threatening me?" Eli asked, his voice steady. The deputy scoffed. "Nobody's threatening anybody. We just need to be sure everything's in order here." Eli narrowed his eyes. "Everything has been in order here for over 100 years, he said. "Only thing that's out of place is you two." For a moment, neither man spoke. The younger deputy cleared his throat, shifting uncomfortably, but his partner stayed put, jaw tight, eyes locked on Eli. Eli had seen this game before. If he gave them an inch, they would take a mile. If he backed down, they would come back next time even bolder. And next time, maybe they wouldn't just be asking questions. Maybe they'd be carrying more than just words. That's when Eli made his decision. Enough was enough. Slowly, he reached into his pocket and pulled out his phone again. He flipped it open, dialed a number, and then held it up to his ear. The deputies watched him closely. After a few rings, someone picked up on the other end. Eli's voice was calm, but firm when he spoke. "Hey, son," he said, "I need you to have a word with these officers." The older deputy frowned, suddenly unsure. The younger one blinked, looking at Eli with new curiosity. Eli extended the phone toward them. "Go on," he said. "Take it." Neither deputy moved right away, but there was something different in their eyes now. They could tell something was off, something they hadn't expected. And in just a few seconds, they were about to find out exactly who Eli had just called. The older deputy hesitated before taking the phone from Eli's outstretched hand. His confident smirk had disappeared, replaced by a cautious expression. The younger deputy, standing slightly behind, watched with curiosity and growing nervousness. Eli crossed his arms and waited. He had seen the shift in their behavior the moment he made the call. That was the thing about men like these. They carried themselves like they owned the world until they ran into someone who reminded them they weren't above the rules. The older deputy finally lifted the phone to his ear. "Oh, hello," he said, trying to sound professional. For a moment, there was silence. Then, from the other end of the call, a voice spoke, a deep, authoritative voice, the kind of voice that commanded attention. The deputy's expression changed immediately. His posture stiffened, his jaw tightened, and his eyes darted toward his partner. "Yes, sir," the deputy said quickly, straightening his shoulders. "No, sir, we were just." He stopped, listening. His face grew pale. "I understand, sir." "No, sir," there was no. Another pause. Then he swallowed hard and nodded. "Yes, sir. Right away." Eli watched in quiet satisfaction as the man's confidence drained with every word. The younger deputy, sensing something was wrong, took a step forward. "Who is it?" he whispered. The older deputy ignored him. Instead, he lowered the phone and turned back to Eli, his expression unreadable. Slowly, almost reluctantly, he handed the phone back. Eli took it, but he didn't put it away just yet. The younger deputy, growing impatient, looked between the two men. "What's going on?" he asked. The older deputy hesitated before answering. His voice was lower now, controlled but tense. "That was Malcolm Carter," he said. The younger deputy frowned. "Who's Malcolm Carter?" The older deputy shot him a sharp look. "The U.S. Attorney General." The younger deputy's face went blank for a second. Then his eyes widened in shock. His mouth opened slightly as if he wanted to say something, but no words came out. He turned to Eli with a new understanding, his gaze filled with both surprise and regret. Eli gave them both a long, steady look. He didn't gloat. He didn't have to. The silence hanging between them was enough to make his point. The older deputy cleared his throat and straightened his uniform. Mr. Carter," he said, his voice now much more respectful. I think we might have made a mistake coming out here today." Eli raised an eyebrow. "You think?" The younger deputy, still stunned, finally found his voice. "We didn't know." He stopped himself, realizing how bad that sounded. "I mean, we weren't trying to cause any trouble." Eli gave a small nod but didn't let them off the hook that easily. "Didn't seem that way a few minutes ago," he said. "Seemed like you were real sure I was up to something." Neither of the deputies had an answer for that. The older one cleared his throat again. We should be going now," he said. "We won't bother you again, sir." Eli didn't say anything. He just watched as the two men turned and walked back to their patrol car. They moved faster than before, eager to leave the situation behind. The older deputy slid into the driver's seat, gripping the wheel tightly, while the younger one got in beside him, still shaken. Eli stood firm as the car started, watching as the dust kicked up behind it. He didn't look away until the vehicle disappeared down the road. Finally, he let out a slow breath. He looked down at his phone, flipping it closed before tucking it back into his pocket. Then, without another word, he turned and walked toward his house. He wasn't surprised that they had come today. Trouble had a way of finding him, no matter how quietly he lived his life. But what those deputies had learned, what so many had failed to understand before them, was that he was not a man who could be pushed around. His son had worked hard to reach his position, becoming one of the most powerful legal figures in the country. But Eli, he had fought just as hard, in different ways. He had stood his ground when others tried to take what was his. He had endured more than most men could imagine. And still, he remained. As he reached his porch, he paused for a moment, looking out at his land. The fields stretched wide under the afternoon sun, the crops standing tall and strong. Just like him. With a small nod to himself, Eli stepped inside. The farm was safe. For now. But this wasn't the end of the story. Not by a long shot. Eli Carter sat on his porch, rocking slowly in his old wooden chair. The sun hung lower in the sky now, casting a warm golden light over the farm. A gentle breeze rustled the tall grass near the fence, and the familiar sounds of birds filled the air. To anyone passing by, it looked like a peaceful evening, just another quiet day on a family farm. But inside Eli's mind, thoughts moved like storm clouds. He had dealt with men like those deputies before, men who thought they had the right to question him, to doubt him, to treat him as if he didn't belong on land that had been in his family for over a century. He sighed, rubbing his hands together, feeling the roughness of his calloused skin. Hard work had shaped these hands, not trouble. And yet trouble always seemed to find him. A sound broke through his thoughts, the low rumble of a car engine. Eli looked up just as a sleek black SUV turned onto the dirt road leading to his house. He didn't need to guess who it was. He already knew. The vehicle rolled to a stop near the porch, and the driver's door opened. A tall, broad-shouldered man stepped out, dressed in a crisp dark suit, his shoes barely collecting dust on the dry ground. He took off his sunglasses, revealing sharp, intelligent eyes. "Dad," the man said, his deep voice carrying across the yard. Eli gave a small nod. Malcolm. Malcolm Carter, the U.S. Attorney General, walked up the steps and sat down on the porch beside his father. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The silence wasn't uncomfortable. It was the silence of two men who didn't need many words to understand each other. "I heard about what happened," Malcolm finally said, resting his elbows on his knees. "You okay?" Eli let out a dry chuckle. "Boy, I've been through worse. You know that." Malcolm sighed. "I do. But that doesn't mean I have to like it." He looked out at the fields, his face thoughtful. They didn't know who they were messing with, did they? Eli shook his head. "No, they didn't. But that's the thing, son. It shouldn't matter who I am. I shouldn't have to make a phone call just to be left alone." Malcolm pressed his lips together, nodding slowly. "You're right." Eli turned to look at his son. "I don't want you pulling strings for me, Malcolm. I can handle my own fights." Malcolm gave a small smile. "I know you can. You always have. But this isn't just about you, Dad. How many others go through the same thing and don't have someone they can call?" Eli didn't answer right away. He had spent his whole life fighting to be treated with the same respect as any other man. But Malcolm was right. He had been lucky this time. Others might not be. Malcolm leaned forward. "I looked into those deputies. This isn't the first time they've done something like this. They've been targeting folks, harassing them, using their badges as an excuse to intimidate people." Eli's jaw tightened. "So what are you going to do about it?" Malcolm's eyes hardened. "What I always do, make sure justice is served." Eli studied his son for a moment, then nodded approvingly. "Good." The two men sat in silence again, the weight of the conversation settling between them. The sky was turning shades of orange and pink now, the sun beginning to dip behind the hills. After a moment, Malcolm leaned back in his chair. "You ever think about retiring, Dad?" Eli let out a laugh. "And do what? Sit around all day? I've been working this land longer than you've been alive. Ain't nothing else I'd rather be doing." Malcolm smiled. "I figured you'd say that." Eli looked out at the fields, his face calm but thoughtful. "This land, it's more than just dirt and crops. It's history, it's family. As long as I'm able, I'll be here, making sure nobody takes it from us. Malcolm nodded, respect in his eyes. Then I'll make sure nobody tries. The conversation drifted to lighter topics after that. They talked about family, about life in Washington, about old memories from when Malcolm was a boy running through these same fields. After a while, Malcolm stood up, brushing the dust from his suit. I should get going, but I'll be keeping an eye on things here. Eli stood too, placing a firm hand on his son's shoulder. You do what you need to do. I'll be right here. Malcolm gave his father a long look, then nodded. Without another word, he walked back to his SUV and got inside. Eli watched as the vehicle disappeared down the road, kicking up dust in the evening light. He turned back to his farm, taking in the sight of it. The land, the barn, a house that had stood through generations. Trouble had come knocking today, but it had left empty-handed. And as long as Eli Carter had breath in his body, that wasn't going to change. Eli Carter woke up early the next morning, just as the sun began to rise over his farm. He had always been a morning man. Years of working the land had trained his body to rise with the light. The air was cool, the sky painted in soft shades of pink and gold. He stood on his porch for a moment, taking it all in, letting the fresh breeze fill his lungs. But as peaceful as the morning was, Eli couldn't shake the feeling that trouble wasn't done with him yet. After his son Malcolm left the night before, Eli had thought long and hard about what happened with the deputies. He had seen men like them before, full of arrogance when they thought no one could challenge them, but quick to back down when real power stepped in. Still, something told him this wasn't over. He grabbed his work gloves and headed toward the barn. There was always work to do, no matter what was going on. His farm had survived through tough times before, and he wasn't about to let a couple of deputies change that. As he reached the barn, he heard the distant rumble of a car approaching. His hands tightened into fists. He turned toward the road, watching as a black and white patrol car slowly rolled up the dusty path leading to his house. They were back. Eli didn't move. He stood tall, waiting. The car came to a stop, and the doors swung open. But this time, it wasn't the same two deputies. A different man stepped out, a sheriff. He was older, with graying hair and a thick mustache. His uniform was pressed, his badge polished. He walked with a steady, deliberate pace, his eyes locked on Eli. "Mr. Carter," the sheriff greeted, his voice even. Eli nodded but didn't offer a handshake. "Sheriff." The sheriff glanced around the farm, taking in the sight of the fields, the barn, and the house that had stood for generations. Then he turned his gaze back to Eli. "I heard there was some trouble here yesterday," he said. Eli crossed his arms. "That's one way to put it." The sheriff sighed, shifting his weight. Those two deputies, Harrison and Miller, they were out of line. Eli raised an eyebrow. "That's so." The sheriff nodded. "They had no business being here. No real reason to question you. I want you to know, Mr. Carter, that's not how we do things. Not how we're supposed to, anyway." Eli studied the sheriff for a long moment. He had met enough lawmen in his time to know that words didn't mean much unless there was action behind them. "So what are you going to do about it?" Eli asked. The sheriff hesitated, then let out a slow breath. "They've been suspended," he admitted, "and there's going to be an investigation into their conduct." Eli nodded, but he wasn't impressed just yet. "Suspended," he repeated. "And when that's over, what then?" The sheriff's jaw tightened. "That depends on what the investigation finds." Eli gave a short, dry chuckle. "I think we both know what it'll find." The sheriff didn't argue. He looked down for a moment, then back up. "I won't pretend the system is perfect, Mr. Carter. I know there are bad apples, but I also know we need to do better." Eli met his eyes. "Then do better." The sheriff let out another breath, nodding slightly. "I intend to." For a moment, there was nothing but the sound of the wind rustling through the fields. Then the sheriff shifted. "You need anything, Mr. Carter, you call me directly." Eli didn't say anything at first. He just watched as the sheriff pulled a small card from his pocket and held it out. After a moment, Eli took it. The sheriff gave a final nod before turning and walking back to his car. He climbed in, started the engine, and drove away, leaving a trail of dust in his wake. Eli stood there, watching until the car disappeared. Then he looked down at the card in his hand, the sheriff's direct number. He slipped it into his pocket and turned back toward his barn. The fight wasn't over. He knew that, but at least now, the right people were paying attention. As he got back to work, he felt something different in the air. Maybe it was just another morning on the farm. Or maybe, just maybe, things were starting to change. Eli Carter spent the rest of the day tending to his farm. The sun climbed high in the sky, casting a warm glow over the fields. He moved from one task to another, checking the crops, feeding the animals, and repairing a section of the fence near the barn. But no matter how much he tried to focus on his work, his mind kept drifting back to what had happened over the past 2 days. The visit from the deputies, the phone call to Malcolm, the sheriff's appearance that morning. Everything felt like the beginning of something bigger. By the time evening rolled around, Eli was tired but restless. He sat on the porch with a cup of coffee, watching the sun sink lower. The air was cooler now, carrying the scent of fresh soil and grass. Then he heard it again. The low rumble of an approaching vehicle. Eli placed his cup down and stood up, watching as another car turned onto the dirt road leading to his house. It wasn't a police car this time. It was an older truck, dark blue with a thin layer of dust covering it. As it pulled up, Eli recognized the driver immediately. A younger man stepped out, tall and lean, with sharp features and deep brown eyes. He wore worn-out jeans and a faded work shirt. His hands were rough from years of labor, just like Eli's. "Calvin," Eli said, nodding at the man. "Mr. Carter," Calvin replied, walking up the steps to the porch. Eli had known Calvin for years. He was a farmer too, his land sitting a few miles down the road. His family had been in the area almost as long as Eli's. They weren't blood, but they were part of the same community, the kind that looked out for each other. "Everything all right?" Eli asked. Calvin sighed and ran a hand over his face. "I heard what happened. Word travels fast around here." Eli wasn't surprised. Nothing stayed a secret in a small town for long. Calvin sat down on the porch steps, glancing toward the fields before looking back at Eli. "You know you're not the only one they've been messing with, right?" Eli narrowed his eyes. "Go on." Calvin leaned forward, resting his arms on his knees. "They came by my place last week, said they were checking on some property issues. But I knew what it was. Same story as always. Acting like we don't belong on our own land." Eli's jaw tightened. "Did they give you trouble?" Calvin shook his head. "Not like they did with you. But they made it clear. They were looking for a reason to make things difficult." Eli exhaled slowly. He had suspected as much. Those deputies hadn't just been after him. They were testing the waters, seeing who they could intimidate. "And it's not just me," Calvin continued. "A few others around here have had visits too. Some don't want to talk about it, but I know what's going on." Eli nodded, his mind working through the situation. This wasn't just about him. It was bigger. Calvin looked up at him. "So, what now?" Eli didn't answer right away. He stared out at the horizon, watching as the last bit of sunlight faded. The answer was clear in his mind, but he took a moment before saying it out loud. "We stand our ground," Eli finally said. "We don't let them push us off our land. We don't let them scare us into silence." Calvin nodded, his expression firm. "I figured you'd say that." Eli turned to look at him. "But we don't do this alone. We get the others together. We make sure we're watching out for each other." Calvin gave a small smile. "Now that sounds like a plan." The two men sat in silence for a few moments, the weight of the conversation settling between them. Then Calvin stood up, dusting off his jeans. "I'll start talking to folks," he said. "See who's willing to come together." Eli nodded. "Good, and if anything happens, you call me." Calvin held out his hand. "Same goes for you, Mr. Carter." Eli shook it, a firm grip between two men who understood each other. As Calvin climbed back into his truck and drove away, Eli sat back down, his mind clearer than it had been all day. This wasn't over. But now, he wasn't standing alone. The next morning, Eli Carter was up before the sun. He had barely slept the night before, but that didn't matter. His mind was sharp, and his purpose was clear. After Calvin's visit, Eli knew this wasn't just about him anymore. Those deputies had been making trouble for other farmers too, trying to intimidate them, looking for reasons to disrupt their lives. But they had underestimated the strength of a community that had been here for generations. Eli finished his morning chores quickly, feeding the animals, checking the fences, and walking the land as he always did. The earth beneath his feet felt solid, unshaken. No one was going to take it from him or anyone else. By the time the sun was fully up, a few trucks had already started arriving. One after another, men stepped out, farmers, workers, landowners, people who had heard what happened and were ready to talk. Calvin was the first to step up the porch. "We've got a good group," he said, nodding toward the growing crowd. "More are on the way." Eli looked out at the faces before him. Some young, some old, but all of them determined. Some had been quiet about their struggles, unsure if they could fight back. But now, they weren't alone. Eli cleared his throat and stepped forward. The small crowd hushed, all eyes on him. "I know why you're here," he began, his deep voice steady. "We've all dealt with trouble before. We've worked through hard times, held on to our land, and kept our families safe. But now, some folks think they can come here and push us around." A few men muttered in agreement. Some nodded. "They think they can make us feel small," Eli continued. "They think they can scare us into silence." He paused, looking around at the familiar faces, but they don't know who they're dealing with. A murmur of approval spread through the group. Calvin stepped forward. "They came to my land too," he said. "And I know they've been to some of yours. How long are we supposed to just take it?" A younger man named Leroy spoke up. "My grandfather worked this land before me, my father after him, and now me. Ain't nobody gonna tell me I don't belong here." Eli nodded. "That's right." He took a deep breath. "Now, I've already made some calls. The sheriff came by yesterday, and I let him know what's been going on. He says those deputies are being investigated." There were a few scoffs in the crowd. Not everyone trusted the sheriff to do the right thing. Eli held up a hand. "I don't know how far that investigation will go. But I do know this. We need to stand together. Watch each other's backs. If they come around asking questions, trying to cause trouble, they'll know they're not just dealing with one man. They're dealing with all of us." A few men clapped. Others murmured in agreement. The energy was shifting. Eli went on. "We've got the law on our side this time. My boy, Malcolm, is working on it too. He's already making sure the right people know what's been happening out here." At the mention of Malcolm Carter, U.S. Attorney General, some of the men straightened up. Knowing that someone in Washington was paying attention made a difference. Leroy's father, Mr. Jameson, an older man with silver hair and a strong build, stepped forward. "You know, Eli, back in the day, our fathers and grandfathers had to fight for every inch of land they kept. And we're still fighting." He paused, looking around the group. "But I'll be damned if I let my grandchildren grow up afraid." The crowd grew louder, voices rising in agreement. Calvin nodded. "So what's the plan, Eli?" Eli looked around at them, his jaw set firm. "We do what we've always done. We stay ready. We keep records. If any one of us gets harassed, we write it down, take pictures, and make sure there's proof. We don't give them any excuses to twist the truth." A few heads nodded. "And we keep talking," Eli added. "If something happens, We don't stay quiet about it. We let folks know. We let the right people know. The group was fully on board now. There was no more fear, only a shared sense of purpose. Eli glanced at Calvin. You were right to bring everyone together. Calvin gave a small smile. Figured you'd have something to say. Eli chuckled. I always do. The meeting ended with handshakes, agreements, and a renewed sense of unity. As the men got back into their trucks and drove off, Eli stood on his porch, watching them go. This wasn't just a farm anymore. It was a symbol. And he wasn't just standing up for himself. He was standing up for all of them. No matter what came next, he knew one thing for sure. Eli Carter stood on his porch the next morning, the golden sun rising over his farm. The air was crisp, the sound of birds filling the quiet morning. It should have been like any other day, but he knew better. Today felt different. Yesterday's meeting had sparked something. The farmers had come together, voices united, standing firm against the trouble that had been brewing. They were done being pushed around, done being silent. Eli sipped his coffee, his eyes scanning the road ahead. He didn't expect trouble right away, but he knew it would come eventually. That's how things worked. When people in power felt threatened, they always pushed back. Then, as if on cue, a dark-colored car appeared in the distance, kicking up dust as it made its way toward his house. Eli set his cup down, already knowing this wasn't just a friendly visit. The car rolled to a stop, and two men stepped out, neither in police uniforms. Instead, they wore suits, their expressions serious. Eli didn't move. He let them come to him. One of the men, tall with sharp eyes, nodded in greeting. Mr. Carter. Eli crossed his arms. That's me. The man pulled out a badge from his coat pocket. Agent Davis, Department of Justice. This is Agent Brooks. He motioned toward the second man. We'd like to ask you a few questions. Eli raised an eyebrow. About what? Davis sighed. Your son, Malcolm Carter, has been making a lot of noise in Washington about what's been happening out here. We're here to look into it. Eli studied the two men. He wasn't sure if they were here to help or if they were just another part of the system that had looked the other way for too long. Look into it, huh? Eli said. That what you call it? Brooks, the shorter of the two, shifted his weight. We're here to make sure justice is served. Your son made it clear that this situation needs federal attention. Eli let that sink in. He had always been proud of Malcolm, but hearing it out loud, knowing his son had used his position to fight for their community, filled him with a different kind of pride. Davis cleared his throat. We've already spoken to the sheriff. He confirmed that the two deputies involved have been suspended. But Mr. Carter, we both know this goes deeper than two men abusing their power. Eli nodded slowly. That it does. Brooks pulled out a small notebook. We'd like to speak with some of the other farmers who have been affected. Gather more statements. Collect any evidence you have. Eli considered their words carefully. The people in his community had been dealing with injustice for years, and now finally there was someone willing to listen. We had a meeting yesterday, Eli said. A lot of folks have stories to tell. I'll let them know you're looking. Davis nodded. That would be helpful. He paused. Mr. Carter, I want you to know that we take this seriously. If laws were broken, if rights were violated, there will be consequences. Eli held his gaze. We've heard that before. Davis sighed but didn't argue. I understand. But this time, you have people in your corner. Eli glanced at the horizon. The fight wasn't over. There would still be challenges ahead. But for the first time in a long time, it felt like they weren't just shouting into the wind. All right, he finally said. Let's get to work. Over the next few days, the agents met with farmers across the county. People who had been silent for years finally spoke up. Stories were recorded, evidence was gathered, and the truth began to take shape. The pressure on the local authorities grew. The sheriff, despite his earlier words, suddenly found himself under scrutiny. People wanted to know how deep the corruption ran and how long it had been ignored. Then, one evening, Eli got another call from Malcolm. "Dad," his son said, his voice steady, "it's happening." Eli didn't need to ask what he meant. He already knew. The Department of Justice was opening a full investigation. The deputies wouldn't just be suspended. They would be facing real consequences, and any others involved. They'd be exposed too. Eli closed his eyes for a moment, letting it sink in. It had taken too long. It had taken too much. But finally, change was coming. "I'm proud of you, son," Eli said. There was a pause on the other end. Then Malcolm's voice came back, softer this time. "I learned it from you, Dad." Eli smiled. He looked out over his land, the same land his father had walked, the same land his grandfather had worked before him. This wasn't just about one farm or one man. It was about standing up for what was right. And they had done just that. As the sun set over the fields, Eli Carter knew one thing for certain.